All right, good morning. Welcome back. Now I get to talk a little bit. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. We've got two more speakers this session. We'll have a break at 10:30 after our sponsor message. So our next speaker is Jason Coposky. He's the Executive Director of the iRODS Consortium. And he's going to talk about some things that we let him work on this year. So some new capabilities that we've been working on, indexing and publishing.
I get to have fun every now and then these days. So this actually kind of dovetails nicely into something that Ton was talking about as to how we can improve the development model within the entire community. And I'll talk a little bit about that and then actually get into the fun things that I did with this sort of new approach. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with the concept of these capabilities. I hesitate to use the idea or the word product because this isn't something that is shrink wrapped and you can install and then it just does everything you want. These are pieces and parts of functionality that we have gathered from the community and then tried to combine and distill them down into something that you can simply install and configure. So I always like to have a nice theme. The theme with this is always configuration, not code. So you can install storage tiering or automated ingest, configure it to your particular requirements, and then carry on. And so we have released storage tiering, we've released automated ingest, auditing, and then the next two that I've worked on was indexing and publishing. And so here's where I take a step back and talk about something that I've been working on in the last year and sort of mulling over, is we have this technology stack up here in the upper left-hand corner, and at the bottom is always the core competencies. So that would be, what we're familiar with and we've all talked about, which would be data virtualization, discovery, workflow automation, and secure collaboration, or as we call it, federation. And above that, philosophically in my mind, is policy. Those are the things that we implement based on top of the technology of the underlying, iRODS strata, if you will. And then above that is what we call the capabilities, which we saw previously. One more stack up in the slide. So dropping down one stack, how do we take all of the policy and distill it down in a way that we can make it reusable so we can compose it into these different capabilities or basically all of the functionality you wish to achieve for your organization? And so if we take an example of storage tiering, effectively that's about 5 different things that we need to do. We need to identify the access time for the data objects as they flow through the system. We need to identify violating data objects per one tier so we know that we need to move them to the next tier. And then in order to move them, in order to implement data movement, we have 3 different steps, which would be data replication, data verification, and then data retention. Do we keep the previous replica or not? And effectively, what we've gone back and done is re-implemented storage tiering as these 5 different pieces of policy that we can now compose from a software engineering point of view into the overarching storage tiering capability. So in this particular implementation, the storage tiering capability is effectively just a policy framework that delegates all of these different responsibilities out to the underlying policies that are used to compose the storage tiering. So it's effectively just 5 building blocks and then a framework on top of it that uses a well-known interface, as Ton said, to delegate these different policy invocations. And so that's effectively what we have done with both, with the storage tiering as well as the indexing and publication. And so we have well-known conventions for naming these policies, at least within those that we've implemented within the consortium, that always follow iRODS policy and then the things that we're going to be worrying about after that, access time, data movement, replication, and verification. The key here is that each policy within the framework can be overridden by another implementation. You yourself may have an opinion about how data replication is performed. An example that we use is, let's say you're going to be replicating data over a wide area distance for, off-site durability. Simple example is you have already paid for a Spira or some other fast data movement facility to move that data for you. You can re-implement the data replication step of storage tiering by simply writing a rule in either Python or the native rule language or C++ if you're feeling adventurous, to invoke that copy and then register that replica in the resource, and then now you have implemented data replication but you can reuse access time, you can reuse movement, you can reuse verification, and so on. Or you can re-implement all of these yourselves. All you have to do within this sort of policy composition framework is simply follow the correct signature for the policy that is leveraged within the framework plugin itself, and then you can re-implement everything you want. So the idea here is that now we can build this body of knowledge, this zoo, as I believe Terrell called it yesterday, of all these different policies, and just simply document those interfaces so they can be considerably more reusable within the community. And the example we used during the policy training is you could have one AC post-proc for put, and then literally everything that you might want to do in that particular AC post-proc for put, or we could just have these policy compositions just stacked up and configured in a way that they all behave themselves and understand that they're living within a larger ecosystem. So having said all of that and taken a step back and re-implemented the storage tiering, I took a step forward and figured it'd be worth seeing how this new model might behave with some other less obvious implementations. And so we started with indexing. And this is effectively another policy framework plugin. It's written in C++, but don't get wrapped around the idea that these are plugins. This could simply have been implemented in the native rule engine or the Python rule engine as well. And the whole idea here is that we have a scalable full text and metadata indexing service, and this is all driven by metadata based on the collections themselves. So the indexing technology of choice is driven by that metadata, and it's simply delegated out of the policy framework to another policy invocation. And the same is true for document types. So we could have a policy that implements the document type discovery, and you could call out to Tika or whatever service you wish, or just simply make something up by looking at the metadata within the file, and then communicate that back up to the framework. And so indexing is effectively a composition of the document type policy and delegates out the object indexing, the purging of the index, so we're going to want to remove the records if the data object is deleted, as well as the metadata indexing and purge. And you can see this technology over here on the side. That is directly derived from the metadata that is attached to the collection. So we're using metadata to inform policy, but not by simply having an if-else ladder. We are directly calling out the policy based on that metadata simply by composing these invocations together. And so generally as an overview, we have some services over here, and then effectively any metadata attribute value and unit that are added to these collections will then indicate they need to be indexed. And so we'll have the attribute which indicates this is an indexing event, and then the value in the unit, and all of those are used to drive the invocation of indexing asynchronously to any one of these services on the side. You can have as many as you want, and that's completely up to the requirements of your institute. And so effectively we're tagging collections that indicate they should be indexed. If a new AVU is applied to a collection, all of the data objects within that collection will be indexed. So this could be a concern if you have like billions of objects within a collection. Well, we're probably going to want to take a step back once again and approach this from a filtering point of view, so we could add some filters onto a collection to indicate whether or not particular kinds of data objects should be indexed by particular technologies. And if a new object arrives, it will also be indexed, because that is also a policy event. So if an object is modified, we will be also having to re-index that object, and all of these indexing policies right now are inherited. So if you have a parent collection that is metadata indexed, and then you have a sub-collection that is full text, and you add a third collection underneath that, it will both have full text and metadata indexing. And here's effectively all we need to do once all of this is configured is simply add the attribute, and then the value has a particular convention where we have the index name. That is, of course, up to you. And then the index type, whether that be full text or metadata. The technology is specifically the string that is attached to those policy invocations in order to delegate it out to that particular implementation. Currently, we're only supporting Elasticsearch, but this is where the community comes in at a later date to tell us exactly how and why and where you want to start performing these operations. Okay, so one other concern that we had with all of those billions of objects in these collections is that if you start combining this policy with other policies such as storage tiering, we could have a concern where data could be flowing in at a high volume at the edge, but maybe you don't want the data flowing into those particular resources to be indexed there. It may be very far away. So we've also included the ability to tag a particular storage resource as the indexing resource. And so that way, as data is flowing through the system, if you have various tiering implemented or other data movement policy or replication, you can pin the indexing to one particular storage resource so you're not overwhelming anything else in the system. And that is simply by adding a metadata tag to that particular resource. If any metadata tag is attached to any particular resource, at this time, we're going to assume that any resource you wish to perform indexing or to afford indexing, not perform indexing, will also have metadata tags. And so we're just trying to provide some bumpers as far as overwhelming any one of your systems as well as iRODS itself. So this is where we get down to how all of these things fit together. Overriding indexing policy is very straightforward, or any one of these frameworks, of which there are only 3 at the moment, where effectively if you want to implement Solar or if you want to implement Jenna or what have you, you simply write 4 rules, 4 pieces of policy that follow these specific signatures, and then just attach your string where the technology goes that is going to indicate your particular technology, and then use that within the metadata convention. You can install and configure the indexing framework plugin, and then simply have a rule base or another implementation that is interesting to you, configured within the native rule engine plugin or Python or Go or what have you, also within the system. And then the framework will just simply ask the rule engine plugin framework itself, does anybody implement this particular policy? And someone will vote yes, and then your implementation will be invoked. And so the idea here, once again, is to provide these small pieces and parts that all fit together into possible larger frameworks, and then we can talk about what those frameworks are. That is a community conversation. We haven't released indexing or publishing yet. We're doing this in order to gather your feedback so we can figure out what direction everybody wants to go, so this is the most useful. I know a number of different institutes have implemented indexing one way or the other, and we would like to once again standardize on this as much as possible so we have something to which to react. So, as I said, this is a reactive framework to metadata attributes. If we look at this at a high level, and we're going to see that publishing is exactly the same, metadata is attached to something in the system, and there's a policy that cares about it. When that metadata flag arrives, some policy is invoked through the dynamic policy enforcement points, but I mean, that's not really interesting right now. The framework plugin handles all of the dynamic policy enforcement points for you and calls the policy at the right times. So really all you have to do is plug in those different policy implementations. So as I said, if we're going to implement Solar, for instance, the idea of full text indexing is simply a type within the system that is passed to the invocation. You don't have to implement full text indexing. Maybe with Solar or another technology, you're going to implement some sort of geographic indexing, for instance, and just not really worry about the metadata. Or maybe you're going to implement Jenna and just not really about the full text. That is a choice as far as your implementation is concerned. The indexing is just a reactive framework. And publishing effectively follows the same thing. It provides an asynchronous scalable publishing service, all driven through the same facilities. I have to admit it's really mostly a copy and paste of the indexing with some string changes in there. The best of programming models. So effectively, this is just reached by delegating out to the policy once again, but this policy implements publishing out to data.world. And rather than having a document type, we're actually generating persistent identifiers as a matter of policy once again. We're just invoking one of these policy implementations and taking what we get back and applying that as metadata. So publishing, much like indexing, has a persistent identifier policy that is delegated out, as well as, once again, 4 more policy implementations underneath that for object and collection publishing and purge. Technology, once again, is directly derived from that metadata, and in a much simpler fashion, as we'll see. So as this looked like the indexing, you'll notice that we can also tag a singular data object. So within this framework, we can publish whole collections of data, or we can publish a singular data object. And then on the right-hand side is effectively just different services. Rather than Elasticsearch, we have data.world, we can publish Dataverse, we can publish NCBI, or what have you. Once again, a question of the implementation under the covers. There we go. So, collections of data objects are tagged with that metadata and that they should indicate, which indicates they should be published. Once again, a new AVU is applied to a collection. If there are billions of data objects in there, that could also be a concern. But all of those will then immediately be scheduled asynchronously on the delayed execution queue to publish them. And thankfully, Alan has fixed all of that for us. If new objects arrive, they cannot be placed into a collection that has been published. It is now immutable. It has been published, and then that is the state of that collection at the time. So it's a question of, do you copy that? That's a matter of policy and a conversation we can have in the future. And you can't also modify the metadata either. So if we're going to publish a collection, all we simply add is the iRODS publishing, which is the technology or the framework, and then publish the verb, and then simply the service. In this instance, it's just going to be data.world. In the future, we can start looking at other services we'd like to address. And that service name is directly applied to the policy as we saw with indexing. All we're doing is composing these things and then asking the rule engine plugin framework to run this policy for us. So, as I said, you cannot modify or delete published content. You're going to get an invalid opera type when that comes back, and it simply says that published collection is now immutable. You can also not remove or modify the metadata that indicates that it is published. So we all ask ourselves, what happens if we accidentally publish something? Well, that is only true for RODS users. RODS admins are actually allowed to remove that metadata tag, which would then release the collection, but we're going to assume that that's going to be a conversation first. And this follows, once again, the exact same pattern, and this is the part that gets me most excited, is because it's kind of boring. I mean, we don't want any of these engineering exercises to be exciting, because then that means something's probably going to go wrong in the future. So effectively, we're working to, I guess the word is standardize or normalize and possibly socialize the idea of building these well-known interfaces in a way that we can all reuse them in the future. The vision that I have right now is effectively we have these policy framework plugins, but beneath that is going to be a larger ecosystem of these policies that we can all leverage and have them in GitHub somewhere, checked in and versioned and released, and following all the software engineering best practices. And then, when we discover new capabilities, that's going to simply be a new framework that is effectively composing all of these different policies that we can very easily reuse. And so, once again, the publishing policy is effectively a reactive framework to metadata attributes. I think this is going to be a strong pattern going forward, wherein we can use metadata to drive all of this policy in a way that just makes sense as far as how we can invoke all of these different pieces of technology into the future. So we've seen it with indexing and publishing, so we're going to go looking for something else that also makes sense to sort of help reinforce this a new approach to building policy in the future. So right now, as for data.world, and getting back to the actual publication, we are moving data into data.world. That's the way it behaves. Maybe we're just going to need a URI in the future. And something that I think is interesting that we haven't addressed right now is what are the requirements for publication? So we're just naively putting data in data.world and then telling the world that it is out there, but maybe if we have to follow a Bagot standard or something else like that, if there's some sort of archival information package we have to build, we can wrap policy around the action of applying metadata to perform those checks to determine whether or not this data is even possible to be published to that service because it doesn't conform to the appropriate standards. So that would be a pre-check or a pre-PEP on that AVU application, and then some additional policy with some well-known signatures that we can check on that collection of data or check on that data object to see if all the requirements are met before it is even publishable at all. So that's something that I'm looking forward to doing into the future. So for indexing, we can take a look at Solr, we can look at semantic indexing technologies. I know, some of our community members are already doing a lot of this. We can look at Tika for data typing. And from publication, as I said, we can look at those conformance checks and adding a couple more policy hooks for delegation. There's plenty of life science catalogs out there, as well as policies for implementing persistent identifiers. And this is the library of things that I would like to build going into the future. So, any questions?
Coming to you. All right, everybody look at me so I don't get hit in the head.
I was wondering about there's a difference between the indexing and the publishing plugin, and that the publishing plugin is also working on collections, but the indexing one is not acting on collections. Is this the reason?
That is correct. Yeah.
In our case, we index actually collections.
Yes. Yeah. The indexing does index collections. The publishing will publish collections or individual data objects.
So why is there no signature then for why is there no signature? There seems to be only signatures for objects, not for collections.
For publishing?
No, for indexing.
Or indexing. Well, I mean, we can go back and look, but it does index collections. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So
it's probably cut and paste error.
Okay.
Good catch. Oh, the slide is wrong or the code is wrong? No. Oh, I see. Now that I think about it for another second or two, the collection indexing is not a signature. It's actually a behavior of the framework plugin. So we don't need to implement collection indexing at the policy layer because we're either indexing objects or metadata. And so the framework plugin implements the concept of indexing collections.
The metadata goes on the collection, but the thing that
Yeah.
actually happens is you're indexing objects.
Right, yeah, so you indicate a collection is going to get indexed and it schedules n number of object indexing jobs or metadata indexing jobs. The concept of indexing a collection would require all of that code to be down inside the policy for indexing collections and rather than up in the framework.
It's not making entire sense to me, but I'll have a more
Okay,
detailed look.
yeah, I mean, we can talk about it. We'll talk about it afterwards.
So where's the plugin that will let me allow as a configuration of this instance of the plugin to create those signatures?
Where is the plugin that
Does that make sense? Like, you created two plugins that seem to be very similar. Now for prototyping purposes, I would like to run one instance of a specific plugin and it will allow me to have 3 signatures as a policy enforcement point that are just like this, but my 3 signatures.
So, I mean,
Kind of the meta plugin to do exactly that, to create the signatures for me.
so we don't have a generic framework plugin that will allow you to create new plugins. Effectively, the framework plugin delegates by signature out to the rule engine plugin framework. So that's a design by contract. If you want to implement another particular framework plugin, that would be a new effort, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for prototyping purposes, it would be nice to just have this kind of plugin so that I can say, I want now an iRODS policy replication object.
Yeah, effectively, you would what the plugin framework, like the indexing and the publishing framework plugins do for you is hide all of the necessary gymnastics around reacting to the dynamic policy enforcement points. So for prototyping purposes, you could just simply implement a policy that reacts to the dynamic policy enforcement point, at the lowest level. But then the question is, are you going to combine all of those different pieces of policy into a higher framework? So it's just another step in the software engineering cycle, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it answers. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.